I'm pleased to announce or introduce rather, to be more precise, Mirela Dakić, who is a PhD student at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Zagreb, and whose doctoral thesis is, if I'm correct, also concerned with feminist theory. She will talk about literature as a stolen concept of feminist theory, and I'm really looking forward to hear what happened to literature.
Okay, thank you. Actually, Professor Charlotte Feldman already heard a part of today's presentation because she was in the committee for my PhD proposal, and that's where the idea to present some of this material came. And since then, I became a bit more critical to the references I use. And I think I'll spoil a little bit this nice atmosphere, but we'll get to 6.2 in the end. So when it gets dark, just think of that. So in today's presentation, I'll try to relate some of the subjects of this year's seminar and particular contributions to feminist literary theory and criticism. More precisely, I'll consider different ways we could or couldn't see literature as a stolen concept of feminist theory. And because of this oscillation, I put my title in the form of a question, and I would like if we could discuss it after the presentation, because I'll consider it through specific references, and the question is, of course, wider than that. For example, I will not have the time to focus on the problems of our educational and higher educational system, which is also an important related subject. As we could see in this year's course description, yesterday we mentioned it, and I always liked these descriptions. They were some kind of orientation for me. One of the references for approaching the subject of the stolen concepts here is Kate Millett, whose answer to the cited question, who stole feminism, was, "I sure didn't." And I suppose we could all agree on that, because practically every student of humanities and social sciences knows or should know Kate Millett for her groundbreaking book, Sexual Politics, where she discussed and criticized patriarchal oppression concerning various domains, biology, sociology, class, economy, education, psychology, history, and religion, myth, and literature, which is correspondent to her view of patriarchy as, I quote, a social constant so deeply entrenched as to run through all other political, social, or economic forms. And therefrom, Millett objects putting aside the sexual part in these domains in various revolutionary moments, including revolutions in art and literature. Of course, in later feminist accounts on some of the fields she regarded, especially psychoanalysis, she has been criticized, but these critics didn't diminish the significance of her pioneering book, which also works for Simone de Beauvoir and her critique of psychoanalysis in The Second Sex when we speak of pioneers. However, repeating and answering the question itself, who stole feminism, implicates that possibly feminism is stolen. In other words, that some instance stole feminism from another. And today I would like to put the relation of feminism, feminist theory, and literary criticism and literature side by side to that question. Actually, in its various forms, that question has been put and paraphrased concerning feminist relations with literature, especially from the 1990s onwards. And as I mentioned in my abstract, from the 1990s on, classics of feminist literary theory and criticism had been published in their second or third editions, containing new prefaces with comments about the reception of the book and current status of feminist theory and feminism in general. And Sexual Politics is not an exception. It is the book that had a great influence on the development of Anglo-American feminist literary criticism, and therefrom on analogous researches in other cultural and national contexts. So today we can give examples of critical works in Croatian and Yugoslav literature as well. However, in the introduction to the extended edition in 2000, which I used a couple of months ago, Millet did pose the question about the relevance of her book today, and also mentioned difficulties in the process of publication of the later editions. Besides the extended editions of feminist classics, another aspect of the process of institutionalization, and we could say the canonization of feminist work, is also the publication of feminist introductions, anthologies, readers, and so on. And one of them, which I find really good, is the Cambridge Companion to Feminist Literary Theory, published in 2006, with a great introduction written by Ellen Rooney. And in this text, Rooney shares certain concerns about particular comments in feminist literary studies. She marked this kind of contributions as the genre of lament or lamentation. In Croatian, we would say tužbalica ili naricalka. And the author refers to the fact that some of the prominent and influential scholars in feminist theory from the 1990s often paraphrase the insinuation that someone stole literature from feminists, and I guess hidden it away so they could not read literature anymore. And referring to this genre of lament, I'll consider today the literary variation of feminist stolen concepts. And the possible questions here are: is literature stolen by or from the feminist theory? In the first case, how do we conceptualize the relations between sexuality and writing? In the second case, who could have stolen it, from whom, what for, and how could we get it back? And can we do it by answering that question, or the part of the problem lies in posing the question itself? More precisely, in implying that literature was or could be in the possession of a certain reading or institutional instance. And the latter is a twofold question regarding the feminist concerns with literature. As we all know, it all began in the late 1960s and even before, with taking back the women's part in literature and philosophy, that centuries-long work, which Mary Ellman called phallic criticism, stole from women writers, readers, literary characters, images of women, and so on. In other words, it began in denouncing the contingent basis of writing the literary history, which Annette Kolodny regarded as another fiction, and in demonstrating that critical apparatuses and aesthetic and literary values are liable to critics, revisions, and new conceptualizations. And now, in some later accounts, it looks like someone stole literature from feminists, and I will focus here on the two prominent examples of the so-called genre of lamentation. And it is interesting that both are published at the end of the decades, and both describe the current state of feminist literary theory in terms of a disorder or a disease. The first one is the text, What Ails Feminist Criticism, first horribly titled Who Killed Feminist Criticism, published in 1998 by Susan Gubar, the author well known for one of the most important insights into women's poetics, the famous The Mad Woman in the Attic, written with Sandra Gilbert. And in this text, Gubar accused post-structuralist and post-colonial feminist theorists of causing the metacritical dissension in feminist criticism, leaving behind, I quote, a bad case of critical anorexia, for racialized identity politics made the word woman slim down to stand only for a very particularized kind of woman, where post-structuralists obliged the term to disappear altogether. And she, of course, got a critical response in a year, in a text, What Ails Feminist Criticism, A Second Opinion, by Robin Wigman, who addressed the problem of unjustified homogenization and reduction, and in my view, complete misinterpretation of the post-structuralist and post-colonial theoretical corpuses in Gubar's text, along with Gubar's negative validation of how she calls it self-reflective turn in feminist theory, and the author's normative pretensions regarding the specters of feminist knowledge. However, Wigman didn't consider the critical potential of literature concerning her well-argued critique, which is especially important given, as she says, the crucial fact of the centrality of the literary to Gubar's portrait of feminist criticism at Dakić early years. So Wigman didn't actually use literature in her critical article, and I will try to go from that. So since Gubar got the critical response from which we can now work further, I would like to consider this question of the critical potential of literature through another example, published 10 years after Gubar's text. The essay, I Am Not a Woman Writer, about women, literature, and feminist theory today by Toriel Moy. The author we all know for her introduction to feminist literary theory, titled Sexual Textual Politics, published in 1985 as a comprehensive critique of Anglo-American feminist literary criticism, but also as a critical introduction in French feminist theory to Anglophone readers. And here, more than 2 decades after Sexual Textual Politics, Moy claims that literature, aesthetics, writing, and creativity had become marginal subjects in feminist theory, especially if we compare it to the central place this topic had during the 1970s and 1980s. And in Moy's opinion, we can ascribe the decline of feminist interest in literature to the influence of post-structuralist thinkers such as Barthes, Foucault, Derrida on feminist theory, and to the impact, of course, of Judith Butler's thought, especially her Gender Trouble, published in 1990, on the supposed thematical and theoretical shift in feminist research. And what Moy recognizes as a problem now, but she didn't see it as a problem in the middle of the 1980s, is the impossibility of unproblematic operating with terms such as reading, literature, women, and especially experience, which is a category she criticized before. And I quote, today then theory and practice appear to be just as out of sync as they were by the end of the 1980s. The result is a kind of intellectual schizophrenia in which one half of the brain continues to read women writers while the other continues to think that the author is dead and that the very word woman is theoretically dodgy. And looking back to the 1980s, Moy here refers to the latest influential theoretical discussion before the supposed 1990s break, the one between gynocritic Nancy Miller and post-structuralist Peggy Camus, who employs some of the aspects of Foucault's critique of the author and the humanities in the field of feminist criticism. And now, instead of comparing possible solutions offered by mentioned accounts, which all agree on the necessity of a dialogue, whether or not the core of their contribution is dialogical, in this case only Wigman's was, I would like to follow the accounts on the critical potential of literature in regarding what remained unanswered in that polemics and what is maybe unanswerable, and then that is the question of the possibilities of reading itself and feminist reading. And actually, by taking into account the theoretical background in my abstract, I was thinking primarily about certain parts of these polemics, which I find the possible critical starting points concerning the mentioned laments. And in this two-part discussion led from the beginning to the end of the 1980s, whose central questions are women's authorship and the institutional position of feminist theory and criticism, Miller stayed consistent with the imperative of studying women authors and regarding signature as the basis of identity and political agency, which affects the modes of reading and interpretation, talking about the works without a signature and so on. And while Camus stated various remarks on the theoretical, epistemological, political, and ethical problems concerning that assignment, as long as the insistence on the author's signature is tied up with the unified concept of experience, self, identity, and representation, which are all the categories deeply problematized by post-structuralist theory as the foundations of phallogocentrism. And the paradox is that post-structuralism is later blamed for the disappearance of literature from the feminist horizon. And here is how Camus summarizes her point. If this, she means about the cult of the individual, artistic and intellectual productions as simple and direct expressions of individual experience, which are the categories Moy now uses, although she was very far from them in the 1980s. So if these are principles establishing the grounds of a practice of feminist criticism, then that practice must be prepared to ally itself with the fundamental assumptions of patriarchy, which relies on the same principles. If, on the other hand, by feminist one understands a way of reading text that points to the masks of truth with which phallocentrism hides its fictions, then one place to begin such a reading is by looking behind the mask of the proper name, the sign that secures our patriarchal heritage, the father's name, and the index of sexual identity. And following Freud, Camus questions the authority which authorizes the father's authority and concludes that the origin of the father as origin is lost in an aporia, or in Derridian terms from before the law, a short but important text concerning literature, what couldn't be found is a story about the origin. He says the story of prohibitions is a prohibited story, and then therefore it must be invented. And Camus also points that at the heart of the law lies the uncertainty or the undecidability of literature, the unreadable in the apparently readable law. And what I find most interesting in this polemic and most relevant for the later feminist discussions is Camus' insistence on the critical dimensions of literature as a practice which opposes its contradictions, ambiguities, and empty spaces to every critical account, including feminist, if it tries to reduce the text to a single unified point of view as an unproblematic representation of experience, linear development of the subject, and so on. And in Camus' words, through the practice of literature, one can understand how every meaning structure attempts to conceal its own contradiction, how logical oppositions rest on an aporia, on undecidability. And Camus sees this undecidability as a political potential for feminist criticism. And I find her claims corresponded to Feldman's work on the turn of the screw. Insatiable contradiction, they both claim in their own categories constitutes not only literature, but sexuality itself. So literature here is the scene where the unambiguous becomes ambiguous, familiar becomes unfamiliar and uncanny, seemingly readable becomes unreadable, and the expected answers become problems and questions. And therefore it couldn't be stolen because it couldn't be possessed in the first place. And the only possession could be, to use Cixous's terms, the potential for dispossession. If we can conceive the analogy between women and writing in her work, and this is Camus' suggestion from some later readings, which I will mention at the end. Cixous claims if there is a self proper to a woman, paradoxically it is her capacity to depropriate herself without self-interest, endless body, without end, without principal parts. This is from the newly born woman. And in that sense, by the end of the 1980s, in a dialogue written in the epistolary form titled Parisian Letters, subtitled Between Feminism and Deconstruction, Miller claimed that there is the impossibility to speak about or in the name of a unified subject, which was not correspondent to the beginning of the debate for her position. And Camus underlined that we cannot even conceive the relation between feminism and deconstruction in terms of opposition, or another binary, or inside and outside each of these fields, because they are always already embedded and embraced with one another. Furthermore, I quote Camus again, "It is precisely because the political cannot be reduced to positions taken, but is constantly traversed by this conditioning possibility of coalition, of transference or contamination, that oppositional logic will never be enough." So, to take a look back to the earlier essays I mentioned, and regarding the framework of a critique of capitalism in our seminar, feminist thinking of radical change as related with feminist thinking of literature should be the name for the future coalitions. And thinkers as Barthes, Foucault, and Derrida, which Moy mentions, and Gubar also, and whom Moy followed in the 1985 and now perhaps critically denounced, offer some of the most remarkable accounts on literature as a point of resistance. So I don't see how could we give the critique of capitalism through literature without post-structuralism. This is something I don't get in the earlier essays I mentioned. For example, we could use Derrida and Foucault, but I put Barthes here. Here is the notion from Barthes reading of Balzac, where he writes about the writerly text as ourselves writing. Before the infinite play of the world as function is traversed, intersected, stopped, plasticized by some singular system, ideology, genus, criticism, which reduces the plurality of entrances, the opening of networks, the infinity of languages. And the writerly text demands a practice of rereading, says Barthes, and it is an operation contrary to the commercial and ideological habits of our society, which would have us throw away the story once it has been consumed, so that we can then move on to another story, buy another book, and which is tolerated only in certain marginal categories of readers, children, old people, and professors. And rereading here is suggested at the outset, for it alone saves the text from repetition. And he says those who fail to reread are obliged to read the same story everywhere. And it multiplies it in its variety and its plurality. It is no longer consumption, but play, that play which is the return of the different. And according to Barthes, to interpret a text is not to give it a more or less justified, more or less free meaning, but on the contrary, to appreciate what plural constitutes it. And this plurality, entrances, networks, and infinity of languages remind of Cixous's conception of a text which at the same time acts like a bird and a thief and a woman. Dispossessing the reader while it flies away, giving the gift of depropriation, and maybe taking her or him, which could no longer be a binary, along. And as she claims in her famous The Life of the Medusa, it is no accident that Voltaire has a double meaning, that it plays on each of them and thus throws off the agents of sense. It's no accident. Women take after birds and robbers, just as robbers take after women and birds. They go by, fly the coop, take pleasure in juggling the order of space, in disorienting it, in changing around the furniture, dislocating things and values, breaking them all up, emptying structures, and turning property upside down. So with this beautiful thought, I would like to finish and leave something for the discussion. Thank you. I have to mention this presentation has been supported by the Croatian Science Foundation's project Literary Revolutions and the Young Researchers Career Development Project. And this little logo down Lire is something that my mentor, Professor Zrinka Božić, made for our project. And these are my references I cited, but I also mention one. Camus has a great reading of Cixous. It is titled To Give Place, Semi-Approaches to Hélène Cixous, and on some other occasion, I'm sure we will mention it. So that's it. Thank you.